Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Helen Sosłowski from Oblong Books. And before I welcome our guests this evening, I have a few instructions for those of you who have not attended one of our virtual events before. You can leave your questions at any time during the program. Leave them either in the chat, which you can open up on the right-hand side of your screen, or there's a Q&A module at the bottom of your screen, and you can enter your questions in there. And our authors this evening will address them at the end of the discussion portion of the program. This evening, we're delighted to be showcasing a new series from Yale University Press called Ancient Lives, a series of biographies of thinkers, writers, kings, queens, conquerors, and politicians, both the well-known and the lesser-known from all parts of the ancient world. James Romm, who is the James H. Ottaway Jr. Professor of Classics at Bard College and the editor of the series, is here to talk with his fellow authors Francine Prose and Peter Stothard about the first three books in this series: Cleopatra, Her History, Her Myth; Crassus, The First Tycoon, and Demetrius, Sacker of Cities. And I'll tell you a little bit about each of those books before we hand over to our authors. James Romm's Demetrius, Sacker of Cities is a portrait of one of the ancient world's first political celebrities who veered from failure to success and back again. The life of Demetrius from the year 337 to 283 BCE serves as a through line to the 40 years following the death of Alexander the Great, a time of unparalleled turbulence and instability in the ancient world. With no monarch able to take Alexander's place, his empire fragmented into 5 pieces. Peter Stothard's Crassus, The First Tycoon, is the story of Rome's richest man, who died a humiliating desert death in search of military glory. After Crassus was killed, historians told many stories of his demise. Some said that his open mouth, shriveled by desert air, had been filled with molten gold as a testament to his lifetime of greed. His story poses both immediate and lasting questions about the intertwining of money, ambition, and power, themes that resonate in our lives today. Francine Prose brings a feminist reinterpretation of the myths surrounding Cleopatra and casts new light on the Egyptian queen and her legacy. Prose delves into ancient Greek and Roman literary sources, as well as modern representations of Cleopatra in art, theatre, and film to challenge past narratives driven by Orientalism and misogyny, and offer a new interpretation of Cleopatra's history through the lens of our current era. Copies of all these 3 books are available at Oblong Books and online through oblongbooks.com, and I'll post the link for all 3 of them in the chat during the course of the program. And so without further ado, I'd like to hand things over to James, Francine, and Peter to start our conversation. Welcome, all of you. Thanks for joining us. And Peter's joining us from London, so it's late for him tonight.
Well, thank you so much, Helen, and thanks for organizing this event. I thought that we'd each start off by reading a short passage from our 3 books to give a sense of the characters of our subjects. So I'm going to read something about Demetrius, and because the biography is very interested in his sex life, and of course, we're all interested in that too. I'm going to read something about his first marriage, which took place when he was all of 17 years old. Like most adolescents, Demetrius was interested in sex, indeed more interested than most, in part because his good looks and family wealth gave him more opportunities. By the time of this particular conclave, he had already gained a reputation for philandering. In his family's palace, young women had come and gone from his bed in a manner that caused his father to wink at him knowingly with his one good eye. One day, when Demetrius ignored his father's summons, claiming he had a fever, Antigonus went to the boys' chambers and spotted a hetaira, a courtesan, furtively slipping away. As he entered his son's room, Demetrius stuck to his story. "The fever has left me," he declared. "Yes, I met it just now as it went out the door," his father replied. A sober, serious woman more than twice his age, twice widowed and with children from both unions, was certainly not the bride that Demetrius would have sought, had he even wanted to wed. But Phila, the widow of Crassus, was now a free agent and a worthy dynastic prize. As a woman of known moral virtue, she conferred dignity on any man she might marry, and she carried with her as dowry the favor of one of the most powerful men in Europe. Such a union might cement the bond of the continents established by Alexander, but already fraying, especially if that union produced a male child. Given what was to be gained, the age gap between bride and groom was of little importance, still less the vast gulf between their temperaments. Nonetheless, Demetrius made his displeasure known to his father. In reply, Antigonus whispered a verse of Euripides in his son's ear, cleverly changing a single word while keeping the meter intact. In the play Phoenician Women, the son of Oedipus describes how he lay in wait, keeping silent in servile fashion, as he looked for a chance to seize power. One must be a slave if it leads one to profit, the character said. Antigonus wittily rephrased the line, one must be a groom if it leads one to profit. So I'll stop there and hand things off to Peter Stothard.
Okay. My whole approach to writing about the ancient world is that of a man walking along a wall or a tightrope, and you look down on one side and everything seems rather familiar to us, like this kind of thing that James has just been describing, you know, sort of boys and sex and what their fathers want and what they want, and old women and young women, and that it kind of seems we get a handle on that. And then you look down the other side of the wall and suddenly everything is completely alien and nothing like, it's like being on another planet. And this is just a couple of paragraphs about money in respect of Marcus Crassus, described in the opening pages when he's on his way to his disaster in Parthia. Crassus was not a banker in the way that later men would understand the word. He did not make loans for long periods ahead. His sense of the past, like so many of his time and class, was acute and went back as far back as he could think. His sense of the future was only of the future that was near. What lay ahead in his mind were never more than fragmented hopes, fuzzy expectations. But Crassus did not need to have the skills of future tycoons to be ahead of his time. In order to exercise power through money, he needed only to keep the pieces of the future a little more connected than did his peers, a little more like a jigsaw, a little less like clouds of hot air. Even when camped beside the Euphrates, far from his home, he was still a sophisticated banker for his time, a lender to a deep pool of dependent supporters.
Very nice. That we'll next hear from Francine Prose.
Well, unlike Jamie writing about Demetrius, I've kind of chosen to downplay Cleopatra's sex life, since that was all that anyone had written about for the years since her death. So I'm just going to read a little passage about what she actually did, or what we actually know, which in fact takes up about a page and a half of the book. And then and the rest of what I've written about is what people have said about her. The myth that's come to surround Cleopatra has been woven over the armature of the dates and facts that can be proven. We know that she was the last ruler who belonged to the Ptolemaic dynasty, established in the wake of Alexander the Great's conquest of Egypt. We know who her father was, the names of her siblings, though there is some disagreement about how many she had. We know that 3 and quite likely 4 of her siblings died violent deaths. We know she was highly educated and multilingual. We know, or at least we are reasonably certain, that she grew up in the vast complex of the royal palace at Alexandria. We know what year she ascended the Egyptian throne. We know that she waged a bitter civil war against a younger brother, who was also her co-regent and spouse, a conflict that she won with the help of Julius Caesar, her lover, and the father of her oldest son. We know she had 4 children, a daughter, and 3 sons. We know she ruled Egypt for more than 20 years and fended off the territorial aggressions of the Roman Empire. We know that she initiated ambitious building projects, contributed to the architectural glories and intellectual life of the city of Alexandria, expanded her country's borders, and weathered a succession of serious domestic and international crises. We know she had 3 children with Mark Antony. We know that she and Antony were defeated by Octavian in the Battle of Actium, after which she and Antony became bitterly estranged. We know that her last months were desperate as she tried to survive, hold on to her country, and safeguard her children. We know she died in 30 BC, a suicide. We know that in the immediate aftermath of her death, a Roman leader, Octavian, annexed Egypt, an outcome that Cleopatra had struggled to prevent during much of her reign. That's what we know.
Thank you, Francine. So your introductory remarks lead me to my first question, because the challenges of writing about Cleopatra, or for that matter, about any ancient figure, are the amount that's not known. That is, how do we fully bring out the personality of someone whose record is so fragmentary? So maybe we could each say a little about the challenges we faced and how we dealt with them. Francine, do you want to start?
Yeah, well, the fact was for me was that, of course, what we know and most of what we think we know, I mean, I've read it all, what we actually know, was from secondary sources. And the secondary sources were so interesting. And the way they wrote about her was so interesting. And the way in which, I mean, the book is called Cleopatra, Her History, Her Myth, but actually you heard the history. So what we really are talking about here is the myth. And it was very interesting for me to sort of trace the way her image and her legacy and so forth has been written about over centuries and millennia, and just to look at the writing and the personalities and the points of view of the people who have written about her or made films about her in the subsequent years after her death.
And what about you, Peter? What sort of challenges did you face and how did you deal with them?
I'm always a bit nervous when classicists talk about the particular difficult challenges of writing, particularly about Roman history, because in fact, although Crassus, there are a lot of holes in what we would like to know about Crassus, we actually know more about Crassus, about Julius Caesar, about Pompey, about Cicero. We know more about these people at this time than we really know about anybody in Europe, or as far as I know, anybody in the world, for another 1,000 years. This is actually this period that Cleopatra lived in, and that I'm writing about, was, however many holes there are in it, probably the best documented century for a millennium. So yes, of course there are things we don't know. I mean, if I wanted to write a biography of the lady next door, there are lots of things I don't know about her too. I mean, there are lots of things we don't know we'd like to know. But I don't think classicists or people who write ancient lives should get too sort of borne down just because we don't have obviously the enormous documentary resources that people have had since the Renaissance. We're extremely lucky to have as many guides to what we want to write about in the 1st century BC and AD than we have, and we should be upbeat about that. I mean, and Crassus is someone of whom we frankly know a good deal, and that's why that's what I've been able to write in this book. I can explain why he's an important figure on the basis, quite the sound basis, of a good deal of knowledge, and we shouldn't try and pretend that we don't, but to be too dismissive of that. Classicists often are.
Well, may I say, as a Hellenist, that you writing about first century BC Rome are extraordinarily lucky. The Greek world is, of course, much more fragmentary, and in the case of Demetrius, really, I was thrown back on just a single source, Plutarch's Life, which fortunately is a very full and detailed life. But nonetheless, whenever one's dealing with a single perspective, there's all kinds of questions that arise. You know, how fair is he being? What sources is he relying on? And how much can I trust him? So I think my task was perhaps harder than yours, and I think Francine's was the hardest of all three of us, since there is no surviving biography by anyone of Cleopatra. Is that right, Francine?
That is right. I mean, there's the wonderful Stacy Schiff book, which is wildly entertaining and well written, but as a mutual friend of ours said, it's something like 500 pages of what might have happened. So
that's right. And you relied primarily on Plutarch's Life of Antony.
Plutarch. Yeah, but I hadn't read Plutarch since college, really, and I just kind of fell in love with him as a writer. I mean, as just the details he chose and his attention and the way his particular point of view would express itself despite all his efforts to suppress it. I mean, he was a marvelous writer, and for me, the part of the pleasure of writing the book was just getting to read Plutarch and think about the way he decided to tell the story of a life.
Plutarch was wrote very differently, of course, about different people, and not least because he was covering the same period. So he wasn't going to be an old bore. So I was using Plutarch's Life of Crassus, but of course that covers the same period as Plutarch's Life of Caesar and Plutarch's Life of Pompey, which obviously he considered to be more important figures. And so he dealt with in some in detail. When he gets to writing about Crassus, he takes the other kind of Plutarch. He becomes essentially a kind of moralist. The only thing that matters about Crassus is that he was greedy, and he suffered as a terrible catastrophe at the end of his life because of his greed. So to read the Plutarch on Pompey, Caesar, and Crassus is eventually reading a writer with two at least totally different purposes, and you know, and that's fascinating in its way too. I mean, if we only had Plutarch on Crassus, we'd be in a poor state, because it'd be even harder to write about him in comparison with Caesar and Pompey than it is. But because we know where Plutarch is coming from on Crassus, and we have other sources that are important too, it's easier to look around the whole man.
Well, Cleopatra didn't even get her own life by Plutarch. I mean, she was just supposedly going to be a footnote in the life of Antony and Caesar, and yet, I mean, the cliche is that she hijacked his life of Mark Antony, and she really does. I mean, after Antony dies, he continues with Cleopatra because he became so interested in her.
Peter, did you run across any points at which you had two very different points of view on something Crassus did or something about him, and you had to make a choice?
Yeah, and I explained that in the notes. It was a great thing about these books, I think, is the way in which you've encouraged us to, to choose a line, to take a decision. If there are academic controversies, then we can put them in the back of the book, and that we're not encouraged. And I'm absolutely all for that, to bog down page 4 with, Ex Appian says this, and Dio Cassius says this, and Plutarch says that, which is, frankly, if you're going to pay the money to buy a book, you're paying us, to make a decision for you and to tell the narrative and to tell the story. And that's what I think what you brought, your initial guidance to this series was, and what's so important. But of course, in the back of Crassus, it'll tell you that if there are some disagreements, Plutarch I consider on the whole, even on the military stuff, more reliable and more plausible. One of the arguments was how much was Crassus cheated by sort of wily foreigners who led him up the garden path and, you know, took his money and pointed him in the wrong direction. And Plutarch isn't really so interested in that. Appian and others are. I tend often on those things, when you really put your sort of reasoned imagination into play on a job like that. Plutarch, even when he's being a biographer more than historian, is often, in my view, the more plausible and source, but not always. And you've got to take a choice on every instant. But you shouldn't have to inflict that choosing on the reader unless they want to read the notes.
Yes, I think that's one of the strengths of all three of our books and of the series, is that the narrative is the dominant thread. We can't pause the narrative to say, well, we just don't know what happened here. You know, just as in a movie, one can't, you know, suddenly leave a blank space for something that is not known. So there are various ways that the author has to get past the gaps or the uncertainties without bogging the narrative down. Francine, did you have any points at which you had to make a choice of something about Cleopatra?
Well, it certainly helps if you like the way that the secondary source you're writing about has viewed the original. I mean, that is, Plutarch, as we said, is a moralist, so he's always weighing up the vices and virtues and so forth and so on. But his representation of her was so, I have to say, persuasive and winning, even though there were certain what should I say, prejudices, all sorts of prejudices against her. I mean, it was still very persuasive. And also I felt that because the subsequent portrayals of Cleopatra from the Renaissance forward were so awful and so dismissive and wrong, that it made me value Plutarch all the more. I mean, what a broad-minded view he had compared to, say, the Elizabeth Taylor, Richard Burton view of her situation.
So we've been talking a lot about Plutarch as a source. For all three of us, he was, I'm sure, the major source. But Peter, what other authors or texts did you mentioned Appian, I believe?
Yes, Appian's is a very important narrative source for this whole period, and for parts of it, he's the only source we have. But I think it's also the non-continuous sources that are important for understanding Crassus. For instance, Cicero was someone who had a very dim view of Crassus. Cicero, the intellectual, didn't really like Crassus. The sort of wealthy guy who was able to have too much influence, even though Cicero was completely dependent on Crassus and bought a very expensive house that he couldn't really afford from Crassus. I mean, Crassus was very ruthless with anybody with any kind of who was a bit sort of too keen to seem rich. I mean, Crassus was a very modest figure. I mean, he and in his own life, as far as we know, and he rather despised the people who bought the big houses off him, and that included Cicero. But Cicero's mentions of Crassus, Cicero preferred, for instance, Crassus's son to Crassus. He preferred Crassus's uncle to Crassus. He knew the whole family, and he was able to, within the letters, able to pick off the sort of weaknesses in them all, in the way that Cicero particularly does. So Cicero is not writing a narrative history of this period, but if you're familiar with Cicero, you can pick up many different ways of looking at him. And some of the tragedy of it comes precisely from seeing it in a way through Cicero's eyes, because Cicero had a very, very high view of the young boy who Crassus takes off into the desert, who Julius Caesar lends to him, and who he has high hopes for. And Cicero has high hopes for, Rome has high hopes for. But just as Crassus's last view of his own father, with his father's head on a spike, his last view of his son was also his head on a spear, having failed to break the Roman army out of the absolutely impossible situation which his father had put him in. So, but it's only because you know how Cicero saw these people, father, son, uncle, that the poignancy and the personal tragedy of it comes through more than it would be, more than in straightforward narrative history.
Yes, well, and speaking of non-continuous sources, I was very lucky to have the anecdotes told about Demetrius by a very curious writer, Athenaeus, who was the compiler of a huge collection of anecdotes told over dinner. His work is called the Deipnosophistae, the wise men at dinner, and it's just
marvelous. It's a marvelous book.
It's a wonderful book.
Every writer on the period should study it. It's got more in it than you could possibly imagine on every other page. But they were old bores, weren't they? I mean, these wise men at dinner were actually quite boring. But every so often there's an extraordinary little nugget of gold that you can use, but you do very well.
Well, thank you. Yes, and of course his book about courtesans, the discussion of courtesans by the wise men, was a principal source for me, because a lot of the anecdotes are about Demetrius and his famous courtesan lover Lamia, a woman that he apparently was quite passionate about, and actually had sex with in the Parthenon, which scandalized the Athenians, but for some was a sign of his prowess and his superhuman status.
It's very tricky, this stuff, though, isn't it? I mean, it's very tricky. I mean, Francine says she tried to avoid the sex, which is kind of one way of doing it, because we don't, as usual, we don't, about the lady next door, we don't really know much as much as we would like to if we were writing her biographies. We don't know. What we do know is the use that people make of descriptions of other people's sex lives, and certainly one of the Roman sense of superiority to the Parthians, to this guy Sirena, who made complete mincemeat of the Roman army with a few archers and a few camels, because he knew what he was doing. One of the slurs against him was that he, like all Eastern potentates, never went anywhere without a sort of a baggage train of a courtesan for every hour of the day. It's, to be honest, I mean, the Romans sometimes said that about their own soldiers and own generals that they didn't like as well. It was said of Fabius Valens and others. But you do start to wonder whether this was just, I mean, without wanting to be too pretty, but whether this was just a very, very convenient slur. I mean, was it really likely that people would travel around with these enormous camel trains of courtesans? I don't think so, but I can understand why it would help the Romans to say that they did.
Yes, and I had to deal with a rather nasty story that is told about Demetrius and his sexual predation, that he had a fancy for a beautiful young boy in Athens, an adolescent boy, and was pursuing him with an eye toward seduction or rape, and cornered him in a kind of a steam room of a bath when he had him alone, and in order to avoid being violated, the boy jumped into the scalding water and killed himself. Plutarch tells the story as though he believes it, and I thought it was just too bizarre and grotesque to be believed, so I let Demetrius off the hook on that one. But it's possible that it happened.
But it is hard, though, because back to when I do my walking along the tightrope, some things you see on the other side of the tightrope, the alien stuff, you have to scratch yourself and say, well, it does seem completely impossible to believe by our standards that was either plausible or likely, and yet so much of what happens on the other side of the wall is completely alien. So why should we rule that bit out? I would have gone with that bit, I think.
I know it sounds persuasive to me, but always reading these sources, I found myself asking myself, why are they telling the stories in that way? I mean, what is the particular axe they have to grind here, or and the stories about Cleopatra being this witchy slut, basically, had uses for the Romans, because she was resisting Roman aggression, because she wanted a sovereign country. So if you just kind of looked just a tiny bit underneath the surface of these stories, the reason for telling them became or seemed quite clear.
Yeah, they are quite honest, I think. I mean, we know. If we clear, in Cleopatra's case, Horace's Cleopatra Ode has that problem right from the beginning. I mean, the famous Nunc est bibendum, nunc pede libero, has enormous sympathy for Cleopatra, while joining in the general sense that it's great that she's been defeated. So we know exactly where Horace is coming from as an artist and as a political observer there. And with Plutarch, although he comes at it from in different ways, you more or less always know that what Plutarch is trying to do is to encourage the Greeks, who would by then, remember, being pretty much defeated by the Romans, and Greece was basically a university complex. I mean, it was not a big military deal when Plutarch was writing, and so he wanted to gee up his Greek readers to think that actually they too had people, may have all gone a bit wrong, a bit pear-shaped for various reasons, but they had two people who were as strong and as powerful, and in many ways morally superior, to the Romans. So these are great writers, Plutarch and Horace, and you've got a pretty good idea where they're coming from. And it's not so hard to work from that into what we think is most likely to happen. It's not easy, but it's, as I say, it's not as impossible as sometimes people might like. Well, modern deconstruct, people who would just constantly want to deconstruct everything so that you only have what you're sure of. Yeah, of course, if you do that, you get nothing. There's actually quite a lot that we can be reasonably sure of, or as reasonably sure as we are of stuff that's often lying around where we are alive now. We should beware grinding ancient sources into the dust of science.
I fully agree. Having written a book about the sacred band, which some of my colleagues claim didn't exist, so I took a big leap there. Francine, there's a question in the chat about was it your experience that Cleopatra as a female was left out of these narrative sources and deemed unimportant despite her status and power?
I want to say, duh. I mean, of course, that's partly what I was writing about. And sort of underneath all of it was the fact that she's come down to us, and it was a view of her that came through, again, through the centuries, that the most important things about her life was that she had been the lover of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. And in fact, she ruled a very complicated country for 20 years. So that very limited way, and in Plutarch, right from the beginning, I mean, almost the first thing he says about her in Life of Antony was that she should have taken lessons from Antony's wife Fulvia in how to control and dominate a man. So she was seen as this completely untoward, unforgivable female, again, witch, because the accusations of witchcraft and so forth went all the way through these biographies. And in fact, she seems never to have gotten a great deal of respect for what she actually accomplished and what she did. So yes, her being a woman was definitely, the answer is yes.
A big yes.
A big yes.
Well, Fulvia doesn't come out of it terribly well either, though. To be fair, they were equal opportunity misogynists because they did. It wasn't just foreign women that they were sniffy about her. Fulvia was the one who took Cicero's tongue and cut it out, and nailed it to the wall, and was accused and was very keen on if anybody had been prescribed, and she wanted the money, sort of nailing their head to her elegant garden furniture. So yeah, and Antony's wife doesn't get a great break either.
No. No, well, Antony gets a certain amount of credit for having become involved with a series of strong women, so of which she was certainly one.
Well, and I think that you know, if I could just speak broadly about the series, one of our goals is really to bring the women's role more into the foreground than most ancient sources do or modern treatments. You know, in my own case, the women in Demetrius's life play a major part in this story, and you know, the queens of the Hellenistic era are among the most powerful women in all of antiquity. And we will also have, you know, women subjects from Mesopotamia and other Egyptian queens in future volumes. So
I
that's
think it's important. Yeah,
that's an important goal.
Yeah, it is an important goal, and it's quite striking how the most fashionable period, what people tended to like about Roman history, the Republican period, that they was one of the good ones, is the period which tends to squeeze the women out, because that was an open political society. Once you, it's the more imperial, courtly, autocratic systems, you know, where the world is run from a single household, which allow, probably did allow women to become much more powerful, and certainly has always allowed the stories of those courts to put a much greater emphasis on what women have done. The only problem is that for a lot of people, this was the less important part of the Roman history. So the really glamorous bit of Roman history, the bit that the American founding fathers liked, was the late Republic. You know, was the Republic, and the women don't play as big a part there as they do scurrying around the Palatine under the empire. But nonetheless, they at that time they did play a big part, and there's a lot you can say about them.
That's right.
Well,
And
one can't help but notice. Sorry, one can't help but notice that of all the lives that Plutarch wrote, there's not a single one that has a woman's name at the top of it. So, you know, and Cleopatra was sort of lucky to get into 2 other lives, but that was it.
Yeah, but he did have quite a tight rubric, didn't he? Because his aim was basically to take, you know, people
Great
who,
men.
well, you know, they were parallel lives, and they were so you would, I guess, if he could have found 2 parallel, you know, someone
Right,
who
2 women.
Cleopatra could be a parallel. We know, I don't think it would have crossed his mind. You're quite right, but equally well, the society wasn't in his, you know, the world he was talking about wasn't helping him.
Yes, and if you've ever read his advice on marriage, you will see that he didn't hold women in very high regard. didn't want to give them very much power. Well, we're about 40 minutes in. I think it's a good moment to ask Helen to step back in and see if there are questions from our audience.
Right, I will. We don't have any yet, but while everybody is thinking of the questions they would like to ask, so please put them in the chat right now. I have a question for all of you in turn. Let's start with James. Why did you pick the particular character that you wrote about? What compelled you to choose that person to write about? James.
Well, I've written before about the successors to Alexander, the 5 or 6 figures who tried to step into Alexander's shoes or carve off bits of his empire in the decades after his death. I just find that era just so compelling. I mean, it's succession drama to the max, right? Because the whole world was the prize of victory. So Demetrius is the best figure that carries us through that period. So as you read from the back cover, it's really a through line story. But he himself is fascinating to me because of his he's a case of almost but not quite good enough. He had enormous talent and charisma, but yet not quite enough to accomplish the task that he set himself, which was really just to reconnect the whole empire of Alexander and rule it, to be a new Alexander. And of course, that was an impossible, those are impossible shoes to fill, because Alexander was already revered as a god, and to try to emulate him, it was just impossible. So, my first popular history was called Ghost on the Throne. It was about the effort to control Alexander's empire. And so this is a sort of sequel, I guess you could call it, carrying the story forward.
Yeah, natural progression. What about you, Francine?
Well, of course, I picked her because she was a woman, and I was interested. And as I began to read about her, it became clear to me that she, because only a limited amount is actually known about her, that she became a kind of scrim on which every subsequent era projected their ideas about power, about women, and so forth. And that was very interesting to me, because you could see kind of the rest of history, or all subsequent history, by just looking at the way that subsequent writers talked about her or thought about her.
Interesting. So, and you, Peter? Why Crassus?
I think it's always good to know who's in charge. When the Americans turned up in Japan in the 1850s, they wanted to know who was in charge, and that's where the word tycoon comes from, because Crassus is the first tycoon, but the word tycoon went into American and then into English language, because they were looking to find out who was actually in charge here. Because the president had a letter for who was in charge, and they said, well, perhaps you should give it to the emperor. And they said, oh, no, the emperor only speaks to God. He's not really in charge of anything much. And maybe it should be the shogun. Well, the shogun was just a general. That didn't sound grand enough for a letter from the American president. So they had tycoon. And a tycoon is a guy who is more powerful than he seems to be. And if you turned up in Rome at many of the periods, many of the years that I'm writing about, and you'd ask who was in charge, well, Pompey was rich and powerful and was trampling all over the East and conquering, but he wasn't there. And Julius Caesar, who Crassus pretty much had to invent in order to counterweight Pompey, was also a long way away. But the guy who was lending money to people, doing favors to people, buying and selling and bribing, and had his had his fingers in every pie, was Crassus. And he was like the first tycoon, which was a word that was used of Abraham Lincoln. It didn't necessarily come with the sort of pejorative tones that it sort of has now, something seedy tones. This was a guy who exercised power not by the normal Roman means. And my argument would be that, in fact, in terms of Rome's legacy to the future, although we often think of the great generals and the great speakers, because that we define ancient Rome largely by them, in fact, it was the people behind the scenes. It was the notion, it was court politics, it was financial power, financial play is far more important now, and it derives itself from the first tycoon, and that's the that was the attraction for him to me.
Classic back channeler, wasn't he?
Yeah.
So we have some questions from Diana to everybody. Oh no, wait, we have some before from Heather. Are there modern day figures each author could point to that parallel their ancient subjects? So we're going round robin. Let's kick off again with Jane. Is there anybody in modern life that you would equate with Demetrius at the moment?
Not really, no, because the circumstances he faced were so unique. But I do call him the first celebrity politician. In other words, the first time that political leader, a ruler, tried to use his sexual prowess and his good looks and his reputation for being a seducer and a ladies' man as to leverage power. So in that sense, I guess maybe JFK, I don't know. Youth and good looks and sexual vigor, that's a combination we see in modern politicians too.
Yep. Francine, Cleopatra?
Well, I suppose it seems really weird to compare Cleopatra and Queen Victoria. I mean, I can't think of a stranger.
Oh, I could see that. Yeah.
But both women were dedicated their lives to preserving as much of an empire as they possibly could, and fielding the responses of the people who were their subordinates in various ways, and the reaction of a population to a queen, really.
Mm-hmm. Peter.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Well, there's a very successful American book called The First Tycoon, which is my subtitle, but this title, which is about Cornelius Vanderbilt and the making of America by railroads and steamships and individuals having their own foreign policy in Nicaragua is okay, maybe not quite as modern enough for you, but he's something I think you have to compare. Though at the moment, I'm afraid it's hard not to think that's a cheaper shot, comparing him to Putin, because both Putin and Crassus invaded neighbors that they thought that they understood. And that Crassus thought that he could invade Parthia, that he would find someone to fight against in Parthia who would be reasonably like himself, a sort of cynical old guy who would probably fight a bit of a pretend battle and do a deal and leave him in charge. That's what he expected. And in fact, he got this guy Surena, who's this sort of military genius, young guy, sort of Zelensky of the desert, if you like, who completely destroyed him. So there's a certain sort of, I think I wrote the book obviously before the war in Ukraine had begun, but reading it after that, it's hard not to have some satisfaction in comparing the travails of Crassus and the catastrophe of Crassus to what's happening to Vladimir Putin now.
Thank you. Great answers. So Diana asks, why do you think Cleopatra's suicide is such a predominant image of her in painting through the centuries? And what was it that defeated her?
Well,
two questions, really.
Everyone loves a female suicide. I mean, through history. I mean, Sylvia Plath, of course. I mean, there are many other examples. So it's part of the awful romance with which people have viewed women, especially particularly creative or powerful women, et cetera, et cetera. Also because of the myth or the complication of understanding how she died. I mean, one of the things that was fun was reading the various people disproving or proving the idea that she had been killed by a snake bite, and I mean, herpetologists have been consulted about this, saying that it would have been impossible to fit the gigantic Egyptian cobra into the basket of figs in which the snake was supposedly smuggled into Cleopatra's chambers, because the cobra was gigantic and so on and so on. But that image of the nearly dead woman, the two, I mean, in some images, especially during the Renaissance, there were two snakes, one conveniently attached to each breast. And so there's something sexual and awful and exploitative and endlessly fascinating about the way she died. I mean, we do know it was a suicide. Whether or not it was there were snakes involved, it has been open to debate. But also, I mean, it just sort of fed into or came out of the idea of the Egyptians as being, or Macedonian Greeks in Cleopatra's case, as being familiar with poison. I mean, that horrific painting of her experimenting with poisons on the various dead Egyptians who were contorted in agony all around her. So I think that was part of the mythology about her.
Well, all women were associated with poison, of course. Roman, I mean, the evil Roman. I mean,
Oh, which is
That's what we do.
For the fairly obvious
Yeah.
reason, I suppose, that it was less easy for women to use knives and swords, or allegedly was. I mean, what we do know about Cleopatra and the snakes is that because Cleopatra didn't appear in the triumph, she was keen to die before she appeared in Octavian's triumph, that there would have been a painting of her, because that's what they did. We know they did that. So there would have been a painting of Cleopatra, probably wearing one of the snake badges, snake jewelry which Egyptians wore. So to be honest, the most likely cause of that myth, remember Plutarch and people writing about 100 years afterwards, was that everybody remembered this snake picture, because we knew there was a picture, and we know they had the jewelry, and we knew it had a snake, and that was what most people would have seen. And so it always seemed to me that was I don't know. I'm in the traveling picture show school when it comes to Cleopatra's suicide.
Well, one of my favorite passages from Plutarch is he's talking about the aftermath of her suicide, and he says, well, yeah, the evidence for there having been a snake was that people were looking out the window after her death. People were looking out the window of the tower in which she died, and they're looking across the river, and there's a serpentine kind of path that's been cleared in the sand. And obviously this was created by the snake that killed her. So the idea of someone looking across from a tower, looking across the river, seeing a certain, something carved out of the sand by a snake is so patently absurd and impossible that it gives you a sense of what Plutarch might have thought about this myth of her death.
So, and there's a question here from Karen who says, the panelists are making me wonder if the historians of our own day don't talk about sex enough, she said. I'm wondering how Plutarch would have treated JFK or Bill Clinton. I was thinking of Bill Clinton, James, when you were speaking. And if he wouldn't have dwelled on sexual anecdotes that modern historians would find salacious or otherwise unseemly in a proper study, that maybe Plutarch has a point, that you can tell something about someone's character from their sexual behavior. Anyone want to take that one on? Or it's not really a question, it's a thought.
No, I think Karen has a very good point. To go back to your question, Helen, about why we chose our subjects, one of the reasons I found Demetrius so rich a subject is that we do know about his sex life. And let's face it, that's a big part of people's personality. And it's something we don't often get from ancient sources, but in a few cases we do. So let's dive right in to those few.
Because Plutarch is also interested in all Roman sex life. One of the best bits when the Romans are defeated at Cara and all their baggage comes back, the Parthians are very amused that they all carry some sort of Milesian erotica. There's this kind of sort of a Greek pornography which was carried around by Roman soldiers in their kit bags, and the Parthians affected a very kind of high moral tone about this, and sort of mocked the Romans for this sort of obsession. I think that the people who fought for Parthia were basically all slaves who were probably locked up at night and had no opportunity to buy their own erotica, but nonetheless, it was another way of showing what a bad guy Crassus was, that his soldiers were suffused with. Every kit bag had an erotic magazine in it.
Not just soldiers. I mean, what did they expect?
On the road.
That's right. Sorry.
If you watch the HBO series Romm, which I think is a great
series, yeah,
great series. Mark Antony is given an active sex life, and some of the other characters as well, and that's part of their characterization. And sometimes is even part of the plot. Yeah, I think that's a good model for what biographers should strive to do.
Well, again, though, I mean, partly what I was reacting against was the narrowness of the way in which Cleopatra's sex life became the entire story of her life. I mean, it's as if someone wrote a biography of Bill Clinton and 9/10 of it was about Monica Lewinsky. I mean, it's that imbalance. And again, I mean, I hate to keep harping on this, but the fact that she was a woman, that Cleopatra was a woman, was not irrelevant to the way in which her story has been told.
Yeah. It sort of trivializes any of the great things. We don't hear a lot about the great things or the great achievements as a stateswoman that she achieved. That's not part of the narrative. Somebody has asked Francine, that as a novelist, primarily a novelist, what was it that did you have an urge to write a piece of nonfiction, or let me read the actual words. You are known primarily as a novelist. How did you come to this project, and why did you want to take it on?
Well, Jamie asked me to do it. It was as simple as that. I mean, it just seemed like a good idea. And also, I should say that I wrote most of it during lockdown, during the pandemic, and it was a great pleasure. It was like it was incredibly liberating to be able to go back in history thousands of years, and I mean, in the room in which you see me now, that's where I was for a year and a half, and to be able to just go back in time and write about this life that had been lived so long ago, and a civilization that had been current so long ago was fun, and also under the circumstances tremendously liberating.
So I think we have time for one more, and from Larry Scanlon to everybody, writing about Cleopatra, exploring her story as an idea, a mythic being, and I suppose this applies to everybody. Did you feel that you were getting to her and them as people? Did you feel that you knew them better at the end of the exercise?
Yeah.
Peter, well, yeah.
Yes, I did. It's very hard. I mean, my character Crassus is known mainly for being played by Laurence Olivier in the Kubrick movie Spartacus. So because once Spartacus in the 1960s and in the late 19th century became a hero, because nobody cared about the Spartacus slave rebellion for 2,000 years after being put down until then. But once they started being interested in it, because they were very short of sort of radical revolutionary kind of left of center heroes, to be frank. So they found Spartacus. Once you'd found Spartacus, then clearly Crassus was the bad guy. And so you created essentially every bad thing about Rome, kind of luxurious, decadent, kind of evil, kind of that was piled onto Crassus in order that he should be as different as possible from Spartacus. Well, that's fine. That was a good movie, but Crassus's importance was really not that. In fact, he wasn't that. Nobody at the time suggested he was anything like that. Quite the reverse. He was a rather modest guy. He was very nice to his wife and children, and lived in a very modest house, considering he was the richest guy in the world. So it couldn't. I mean, it's almost in Cleopatra level the way in which the movie completely upturns everything that we know about him. And for that reason alone, given his importance in the breakup of the end of the Republic and its turning into empire, it's important and very useful that we should understand that correctly rather than wrongly. Sometimes history really does matter.
Francine?
I'll just say amen to that. I could repeat that word for word about Demetrius, and feel much the same way.
I felt that part of my job here was to try and peel away the incredibly grotesque representations of Cleopatra that have come down to us. I mean, Vivian Leigh and Claudette Colbert and Theda Bara and Elizabeth Taylor, I mean, had to have been such misrepresentations that I felt that what I was trying to do was to begin to get close to whom she might actually have been, and again to clear away the wrongness of the myths and these misrepresentations that have grown up around her.
I understand that. Somebody actually, Karen, referenced the 1963 movie, and she said it was so silly, but all the aspects have stayed with me over the years. Did you see it?
And it's 4.5 hours long.
Oh God, yeah. I think we're going to end. I have a question for all of you to end on, and that is: were there any surprises? All of you knew your subject pretty well to a degree. Obviously, when you do research, you get in a little deeper. But was there anything about each character that came out of that you learned, that came out of left field, that you didn't know before, that was a big surprise? James.
I guess I mostly learned how much people liked Demetrius and really felt pained by his downfall. Even the people who were responsible for his downfall and death had to put out reports or propaganda that made them not responsible for his downfall, because people didn't want to see him come to grief. Even though he caused terrible trouble and destruction, he was still widely loved.
Well,
I found that surprising.
Peter, Crassus, any surprises?
It was the focus in the end on what happened when Crassus wasn't there. Some people are important, and you know when they're alive that they're important, but you don't. There's other people you don't always realize how important they were until they've gone. And Crassus is a classic example of there was a three-legged table that was the end of the Roman Republic: Pompey, Caesar, Crassus. And once Crassus had gone, the table fell over. And once the table fell over, the other two legs were fighting each other, and then you only had one leg, and then you had it was a one-way ticket to the empire, autocratic rule, which with its enormous influence over the rest of Europe, and the extent to which Crassus's absence created the conditions for that. I hadn't. Well, the difference between looking at this period through Crassus's eyes or through the position of Crassus than through looking at overall. And so I too did this in lockdown, and that was I remember that suddenly realizing he was how important he was when he wasn't there.
Interesting. That's very interesting. Francine.
Well, I was impressed and surprised really by the extent and the depth of Cleopatra's accomplishments and her skills and how much she did and how courageous she was. I mean, I think like everyone else, or like so many people, the myths about her had been floating around in my head. And it was a great pleasure and very illuminating to be able to get past those myths and to look at what she actually did.
That's great. That's wonderful. James, I know that you're the editor of the series. What's coming down the pike for Ancient Lives? Can you enlighten us, or is that all under wraps?
No, it's actually on the Yale Press website, so it's public knowledge. We have Ramses II, the great pharaoh of Egypt, coming out next spring by Toby Wilkinson, a very well-known Egyptologist. And following that, we have Julian the Apostate and Phocion the Good of classical Athens, and Themistocles, the victor at the Battle of Salamis. And in future, we'll have a wide assortment of Greeks, Romans, Mesopotamians, Egyptians, and possibly an Indian king as well.
Wonderful. Well, what a wonderful series. We can't wait to read your books and all of the new books that are going to be forthcoming in the series. I'd like to thank you all for joining us this evening and for such an inspiring discussion and for introducing these historical figures in a completely new light. And we thank you for that. Just a reminder that copies of Demetrius, Sacker of Cities, Cleopatra, Her History, Her Myth, and Crassus, the First Tycoon are available at oblongbooks.com. I would also, before we say goodnight, I'd like to express our thanks to Yale University Press, who helped make this event possible. And I wish you all a good night and thank you for joining us.
Thank you,
so
Helen.
much. Thank you,
Thanks.
Helen.
And thanks to everybody in the audience for spending their evening with us as well. Thanks so much. Good night.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Good night.